Influencers don't simply make things happen. And to say that viewers are not making a choice here, to say that they're being controlled, is hugely patronizing. Thank you, first of all, Sophia, for your excellent argument. With the rise of influencer culture, this motion is, of course, relevant and important, and it's something that we need to be talking about. And when asked to speak for the opposition, of course, I was so aware of the complexities of this question, mentally running through every case where influencers have had a negative impact online. As has already been noted by the proposition, there are, of course, many problematic influencers creating content online for millions of subscribers on social media platforms, all of whom, I agree, need accountability, and more work must be done on a structural level from social media platforms to keep online spaces safe, especially for young people. And I do think it's important to distinguish here between free-thinking adults and young people, given the impressionability of young people, which separate advertising laws do acknowledge in the UK as well. I just think that's an important caveat for us to kind of acknowledge, and it feels like two separate questions. Just to harken back slightly to what Tom said before, generalizations about influencers aren't always helpful, and we can't generalize all influencers as a result of that. It would be a fallacy of composition to do that because we can't assume that certain influences represent the culture as a whole. Because for every Logan Paul, there is a Ben West who is championing youth mental health rights. For every Eugenia Cooney, there is an Abby Sharp rewriting diet culture. Social media worlds are as vast and variable as this real one, and as variable as the perspectives which have historically been represented here at the Oxford Union. There is bad influence, but there is also good influence, which this House maintains is a positive thing. But I am going to park that to one side because there's no point sitting here and listing the ways that influencers have had a positive impact. I don't think that's a productive use of this time. And instead, I want to stress the inherent value of this kind of influencer culture in relation to autonomy. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with the Victorian philosopher and economist John Stuart Mill and his famous declaration that over himself, over his body, the individual is sovereign. So to really simplify this idea, Mill teaches the most important thing, the most precious thing is human liberty, our right to make decisions and form beliefs, and he says that this should be protected at all costs. And I suppose the question then is, do influencers put limits on autonomy? And it's a question I've been toying with in preparation for this debate because but one thing I think we have to remember is that influencers don't simply make things happen. And to say that viewers are not making a choice here, to say that they're being controlled, is hugely patronizing and patronizes the autonomy of people, our ability to make choices and decide what we do and watch, consume and believe. We don't just follow influencer advice on autopilot. We don't find ourselves possessed to forcibly go out and buy a box of detox tea when it's recommended online, just to give a really banal example. And so to say that we're incapable of making that judgment, to regret that influence, I wonder who gets to make that decision because we're getting close to paternalism here. Aside from the autonomy of viewers, influencing culture gives people and creators an autonomy which we've never really seen before. It gives people access to, or the potential to have access to a platform, as Sophia did acknowledge. TikTok, for example, is built on the premise that anyone's video could go viral. Still, of course, there are problems with access and algorithms, but we find ourselves in a space where for the first time ever, the democracy of social media means everyone has a way and a means to share content and ideas without the barriers which have traditionally barred people from influence. I study early modern literature, and so please do excuse the fact that I'm going to use this as an example, but I couldn't not. In early modern England, writers needed patrons if they wanted to publish anything. And of course, those patrons, so what you end up with is these letters at the beginning of so many plays and pieces of literature where they're thanking the patrons. And writers needed these patrons if they wanted to publish something, just in terms of in terms of finance, but also in terms of kind of social backing. And at least indirectly, they would have had an input on the content of the piece. It puts barriers on who can publish and what can be published. But we're in an age now, 400 years later, where we have public access to spaces where we can share art, ideas, interests, and experiences. And that is an incredible thing. Social media spaces and influencers decentralize the monopoly of mainstream media and allow for normal people to share content and gain influence in something akin to media democracy. In an age of fake news, and one where media outlet owners certainly do have their own private interests, Herman and Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, has spoken about this quite well. The influence of influencers is not something to regret. Which leads me to my final point, and I think it's worth us thinking about the etymology of the word influencer. I believe in the power of language, and that the language that we use is incredibly important. And so I want to remind you of where the word influencer comes from. It's from the Latin, influence from in and fluere, to flow, so meaning kind of linked to these ideas of imperceptibility, which can make it dangerous. But this is precisely why influence from influencers can and has been valuable, because the word influencer facilitates an awareness of influence. Influence is literally embedded into the very word. And so there is a cultural awareness, just semantically speaking, that influence is happening. The word itself allows for a consciousness around the act of being influenced. Ludwig Wittgenstein famously says that the limits of my language are the limits of my world, acknowledging that semantics and vocabulary are what shape our levels of consciousness. We can't talk about something or think about it unless we have the words and the language to express it, and the words that we use to express it are going to change the way that we think about it. And the word influencer, as this motion reminds us, has that idea of influence inside of it. And so we as consumers do know that. Just anecdotally speaking, I hear friends all the time joking that, I've been influenced to do X, Y, Z. And that cultural awareness is important. So it feels fitting to raise a second question. Is the influence of influencers really the most concerning kind? Why is that the one that we're debating? What about the influence of institutions, government, and media, whose influence can be much more difficult to discern and harder to question? The philosopher Sarah Soriel, when writing about hate speech, says that laws typically focus on how something is expressed as opposed to the actual content, and that speakers are much more likely to be legally penalized because of a lack of education and not speaking in the right way, even though the ideology might be the same. So think about it. What do you think of when I say influencer? The word comes with assertions and assumptions, baggage, and, as I say, so much skinny tea that I hate using it, and I find it embarrassing, as someone who is, I suppose, an influencer, or is an influencer. As a media form, it is at want to be questioned, and adult viewers, free-thinking adult viewers, mostly know that they should be taken with a pinch of salt when they see something online, because they're just influencers, just TikTokers, just YouTubers. But we should be equally conscious of influence when it comes from other sources. We don't need to be regretting influence, but rather increasing awareness around influence when it is there, and especially acknowledging its purpose, its agenda, and its legitimacy. When an influencer does something wrong, shares something problematic, has a negative influence, it is common for that thing to be identified and for them to be called out on it. To remove the influence of influencers, or even to regret it, is not only to regret the democratization of media, but also to regret our growing consciousness that influence exists. And in an age of fake news and misinformation, surely that is something important. Surely we shouldn't be regretting that. Instead, influencers do need to be held to account. Social media platforms do need to be combating individual cases of negative influence. But most importantly, we need to be working towards further developing our consciousness around influence more broadly as a way of strengthening and retaining autonomy. Thank you.